Hello everybody, my name is Anton, and this is not the usual GTA 5 LSPDFR episode. This is a brand new series that I'm calling Let's Talk. Over the past few weeks, a number of you have reached out to me asking me questions about my GTA 5 mods that I have, specifically around LSPDFR, questions about how to set them up, how to configure them. So I thought I would create this brand new series of video tutorials where I'll talk about the mods that I have, my steps of how I install and configure them, and hopefully help you guys run your GTA 5 LSPDFR a little bit more smoother and figure out some of the problems you might be having. Of course, that's a great opportunity to have my camera on so you can see my beautiful face as well. And today we're going to start off with talking about ELS. So ELS, fantastic mod, essentially controls all of the lights that we see on our vehicles. So let's go ahead and we'll start off by first covering a bit of an installation step-by-step tutorial, and then I'll get into specifics of ELS configuration. So essentially, when you first download ELS, it comes in a file like this where you'll see a bunch of different folders in there. And when you go down to installation files, this is the main game directory where you should be installing your files into, so wherever your Grand Theft Auto 5 is located. And then these are the files you need to install. So we got our ELS folder, we have our ELS.ini file, our ELS ASI file, and then Advanced Hook 5. And the chances are you probably already have Advanced Hook 5 installed with some of the other mods you might have put in. So if that's the case, you can copy it over. You don't have to copy it over, whatever it is. Just make sure you have one in your GTA 5 folder. So if we go ahead and take a look at my GTA 5 folder, scroll up here, you'll see that here's my ELS directory. And then when I scroll down, here's my INI file, ASI file, and I actually have a log file in here. So you will not have that in your zip file when you first download ELS. The log file is created when you run the game and ELS loads. So if we actually pop that open, you'll see it looks something like this. And essentially, this would be a good way to actually troubleshoot any issues you might have with ELS, because if you see here, we got OK, all clear, and then OK, main configuration successfully loaded. If you're not seeing that, if your log file looks like this, for example, where you don't see that final OK, all clear, and OK, main configuration loaded, that means there's something wrong. And in this case, there's something wrong with Sheriff 2. So somewhere here, after loading A Coronas, something crashed. So this is a good opportunity for you to go back and maybe figure out what the issue might be. But of course, in our case, as you can see right here, everything is working fine. So this is, if you're having issues with ELS, this is your first step, is take a look at the log file, make sure it's OK, all clear, and if it's not, that's where you find what the problem might be. So let's get out of here, and let's take a look at the configuration file, the INI file. Now, I'm using a program called Notepad++, so that's why it looks a little bit different, it looks a little bit better. You can actually open this file in through Windows through Notepad. There it is. So if you don't have Notepad++ installed, that's perfectly fine. You can open that with just a regular old Notepad. Honestly, guys, not much to change in here. I really left all of this default. There's a couple of things I do want to highlight that I think are essential for you to know. One of those things is if you don't, for some reason, want ELS activated on your AI units, on your backup units, this is the option to disable. So you just want to set that to false rather than true. And then this one, ELS Traffic Control On. ELS has an option where when you pull up to an intersection or there's traffic in front of you, if you blip your siren or if you sound your horn, ELS will actually force that traffic to move and to clear that intersection for you. Some people have reported issues with, trying to perform a traffic stop and then blipping their siren or sounding their horn and then causing that vehicle that they're trying to pull over to just go crazy, careen everywhere, just do some weird shit. If you're seeing that, I'm personally not seeing those issues, so I've set this option, I've left it at true. It is true by default. But if you are seeing some of those issues with cars behaving strangely and doing some just weird shit in the game, go into the INI file and change this option to false. So that will disable ELS from clearing that traffic out of your way. But again, if you're not having those issues, I left it at true, and it's working great for me. And then, of course, this section down here is where we have some of our control options. All of these keys are actually listed. So if we go back into our into our zip file here, or RAR file for ELS that you downloaded, there's a folder here called documentation. This is where all the documentation is located. And there's a PDF there called default controls. So the default controls file will map these keys out for you, so you actually know what key 221 is, or 51, etc. So if you wanted to change any of these options, you can. Again, to be honest with you, I left them as default. I use a controller, and you can see here my controller is set to true. So if you, I think again by default it is set to true, but if you're having trouble with your controller, just double check to make sure that ELS is using the controller. But otherwise, I left everything at default. You know, when you're changing patterns or doing anything like that, you're not really doing that as you're playing the game, so you don't really have to worry about conflicting key maps or anything like that. So really, that's the essentials of the ELS.ini file. Those are the only things you need to really configure here in ELS. Like I said, I did not touch anything else. So let's get back out here and let's take a look at our ELS folder. So the ELS folder is where you install all of the ELS files for the cars that you download. So let's take a look here. I'm going to actually bring up a good example. So I have the a car here. This is actually a car that PoliceCo just recently released, the undercover Crown Victoria Police Interceptor. It will be coming up in a future episode. And essentially, when I open up the file that I downloaded and I go into a folder, you'll see PoliceCo created a folder here called ELS.xml. So this is the folder that contains the XML, this VCF file. This is what ELS refers them to as, the VCF file that will define all of the ELS settings as well as all of the patterns for the car. And the location where you want to put those files is into the ELS folder in your main game directory. So if we go into our ELS folder, there'll be another folder in there called pack_default. So open that up. And here you'll see all of my VCF files that I have installed for all of my different police slots. So when I'm installing PoliceCo's ELS car or ELS file, I want to basically drag that from our downloaded RAR file into this pack_default folder. And you can see there it is right there. Again, I'm going to pop this open here with Notepad. You can edit these files with Notepad that comes with Windows. And essentially, again, I'm not going to walk you through all of the different sections. I'm sure, you know, as much as you want to hear me blab about it, you don't really need to know a lot of this stuff. I'll highlight some of the key areas which I've personally edited, and which, you know, if you want to play around with ELS, those are the areas you'll have to touch as well. So this first section, again, I don't really touch it, and you can read a little bit about all of these different options in the ELS documentation, but it allows you to change things like, for example, how your lights behave. You know, every time you push a button, does it go straight to ELS stage 3, or does it go to stage 1, stage 2, then stage 3? So you can play around with some of these options here. This section right here will define all of the lights that are with the car, so again, you don't have to touch that. The one thing that I do change here in this Misc section is this line item right here, this default siren activation. And by default, most of the car designers will leave this option here at 3. So when you open up the VCF file, you'll probably see 3 in there. I actually like to use ELS, so when I put it into stage 2, I like to use the second stage of ELS, either for code 2 response or when I perform traffic stops. So I actually want the siren to be available at stage 2. So I go into the VCF file and I change this option to 2. If you don't care, if you don't want your sirens to be only activated at stage 3, you can do that. So then stage 2 will just be lights, will not have any sirens. In my case, I prefer to have the siren option available. I can still toggle it on and off, so I don't need to have the siren on. I can just go with my lights. But it's nice to have it there at stage 2, so I changed that to 2. Again, everything else, you don't have to worry about all of this. This is configured by default by the designer of the car. If you scroll down here, I'll talk about the sound section in a second. It is important, especially when it comes to, in my case, I'm using SirenMastery, so you will have a conflict here, at least for the time being, between SirenMastery and ELS. So I will talk about that section in a second. But then we get to our sections here, which are essentially the lights and the patterns. So we have our warning lights, our primary lights, and our, I believe that's secondary lights. And they look very identical to each other. But essentially, this is what defines all of the different patterns you see on your ELS vehicles. So let me quickly walk you through here The options here that you really need to think about is this section right here with preset patterns, and then the scan patterns right here. So the preset patterns is the pattern that will be activated when you take ELS to a certain stage. Not all lights are available in all stages, and you can read more about that in the documentation. But you can see right here, for example, our primary lights, activated both at stage 2 and 3. Now, if let's say you wanted to have a certain pattern for primary lights activated at stage 2, this is where you would change it. So you would go to change that to true, and then define your pattern. And I'll talk about selecting patterns and figuring out what the patterns are in a couple of minutes here. And let's say with the pattern we want to go with is 51, so that's where you would set it. So now every time you put ELS into stage 2, it will activate pattern number 51. The other option, and this is what I'm using right here, so let me just undo all those changes, and this is what I'm using right here in my case. The other option is to go with a scan pattern. So I don't actually want one preset patterns, I want a number of different patterns, and I want them to rotate through. So this is when you look at their scan pattern custom pool option. So what we want to do, and actually I just realized now I have not enabled this, so I might actually want to enable all of these. Otherwise I don't think it's going to work. No, I do not want, no, don't want that. So I'm making changes here as we go along. So I actually forgot that, there we go. So there you go. I actually forgot to enable the pattern. So there you go. Caught my own mistake making a tutorial video. But yeah, this is essentially where you want your patterns to be. So you create a new line item for every single pattern. You define what the pattern number is, and then you want to make sure you set it to true to be enabled, otherwise it's not going to work. And then if you want them to go in sequence, so in this case 9, 15, 20, 21, etc., you set that to true. If you want it to be randomized, you can set that option to false. So that's really essentially the customization of ELS, and let me actually jump into the game to now show you some of these options, because it's a lot easier to actually see them here in our games. Alright, here we are in the game. So this is the vehicle that Policeco has created. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get in. And the first thing you want to do when you're working with ELS is you want to open up the UI that ELS has. So by default, the keys are you hold Control and you press P. So that will also open the pause menu for us, which is not a problem. We'll get out of it. And there now you'll see the ELS UI come up here at our bottom right corner. So you'll see here as I scroll through my different options here, stage 1, you'll see our patterns are now being activated. Stage 2, and then stage 3. And there you go, there's our ELS lights working right there. So essentially, when you first take ELS into its first stage, the secondary lights become active, and in this case, the secondary lights on this vehicle are right there. Now, every vehicle will have different lights. So just because this one has secondary lights right there doesn't mean that those other two vehicles will have the same secondary lights. So you really need to play with each vehicle and really work with each vehicle to not to troubleshoot, but to figure out what the patterns are. The second stage will activate the primary lights, and again, it's one of those situations where you'll have to see, depending on the vehicle, what those primary lights are. And then our third stage will also activate our warning lights. So now in our case, our patterns, and this is where the pattern definition comes in. So for stage 1, our secondary lights come on, and I just left the pattern at 0. So that's what we see right there. So you can actually play around and scroll through some of these patterns. So I believe for secondary, the default key is I, and you'll hear the horn go off as well because that's the conflict, but that's all right. So when I keep pressing I, you'll see the patterns now changing, and this is where I'll go through all of the patterns and kind of figure out what they are, and there could be a lot of them. We're talking, I mean, some well over 100 patterns. So you just really have to go through them and figure out what these patterns are. And then if I bring it into ELS stage 2, you'll see that now I can go through my primary lights. And of course that's going to activate our horn, so I have to remember to press it. But here's our pattern 0, pattern 1. You'll see now it's flashing a little bit different, and I'll switch to this view here. Pattern 2, So you really have to more or less sit here and kind of go through all the different patterns and find the ones that you like. Pattern 3, etc., etc. Now if I hold the Alt key, I can actually scroll back on patterns. So Alt U, so U will advance the primary patterns forward, and then holding the Alt key and pressing U will actually advance them backwards. And I just have to remember to disable my horn. So essentially what I do usually with my cars when I first download them is I sit here and I kind of scroll through all the patterns. I figure out which ones I like, which ones I don't like. In my case here, I decided to go with the scan pattern for both primary and warning lights. So what I did is I went through all the different patterns, picked out the ones that I liked, and those are the ones that I defined in my scan section of my VCF file. If you don't want to scan patterns, and let's say you pick just one pattern that you like, that's the pattern you can set in that preset pattern configuration. So for example, if on primary, we want pattern 1 and only pattern 1, you don't care about it being scanned, what we can do is, I'll just go back here. So we have our primary section right here, and this is where you would put, for example, pattern 1. Right, and make sure you set this enabled to true, otherwise it's not going to work. Now, if you want a different pattern for the third stage of ELS, so ELS stage 2 will have primary lights on pattern number 1, but let's say for ELS stage 3, we want patterns to be primary lights to be pattern number 11, that's where you would change it to 11. If you want it to be number 1, you can leave it at number 1 as well. Again, in my case, I decided to have a bunch of different custom patterns that it scans through. So here's where I define all of my patterns. So I'm using pattern 16, 18, 32, 40, 52, and 64. And it will just sequentially alternate between all of those every time I turn my lights on. And let me just pop back in here. So that's essentially how you figure out ELS and how you figure out all of the patterns and then how you map them. The one thing I do want to point out as well is when you first get in your vehicle, I have not found a way to preset the scan pattern to be the default pattern. So essentially what happens is when you get into your vehicle and you want to go out and do a patrol, I have to remember, and you will have to remember if you are using scan patterns, is to change, in this case, our primary. When you first get in, it will be by default pattern 0. So I just have to remember to always put it into scan mode, and then it will stay there, right? Every time I turn off ELS, it will always remain in scan mode. If I get out of the vehicle and I get back into the vehicle, nothing changes. It will just, the scan mode will stick, so to speak. So that's essentially the way you configure patterns and you figure out which ones you like and you don't like. You know, at the end of the day, it's one of those things where you can just go with the defaults that the designer, the author of the car has created. Some of the designers will actually define patterns in the file for you, so you don't have to worry about changing them. Others will not. So it really depends on you and how you want to play your game. You know, if you do want to take some time and go through all the patterns and figure out which ones you like, you know, you're more than welcome to do so. Let me just jump into another vehicle just to show off the other lights here on this car. You'll see it's going to be slightly different. So in my case here, for my secondary lights, and the secondary light is this traffic control right there, I'm using pattern number 31. So that's the preset pattern that I've set in my VCF file. Turn off the light, turn off the siren here. For ELS stage 2, I actually switch my secondary pattern to pattern number 10, and my primary is 115, and those ones are preset. And then for stage 3, I put my primary into scan mode. My warning lights are patterns 40, and then my secondary lights are pattern 000. So you can see there's the car right there. So you'll see the primary lights scan. And again, it's one of those things where you have to sit and you have to figure out what the primary lights are and what the warning lights are and what the secondary lights are for each vehicle. You'll see here in this vehicle, this is the CVPI by BX Bugs. You'll see here that again, it's a very different set of light. It does not have that traffic control bar. So you'll see our secondary lights are these lights right here in the back, on the sides, and then up here in the front. right? So again, you have to figure it out and find a pattern that you like. In my case, I'm going here with pattern number 46. Here's our primary lights, and then you'll see here our warning lights come in right there. In this case, on this car, I'm actually not using any scanning patterns at all. I've preset specific patterns for each ELS stage. So that's essentially ELS and how you set up the patterns and how you figure it all out. The other thing that I do want to talk about is the sirens themselves. So let me actually jump back into our config file right here. So by default, here's all of the sounds that ELS will activate for our sirens. And you can actually change them, and these are pulled directly from the game sound file. So if you're installing any new sirens and you're not using SirenMastery, and I'll do another tutorial on how to install sounds at a later time, but essentially this is where the sound comes from. They come directly from the game. So if you modified your siren sounds and you put them into the mods folder, that's where it will draw them. One of the things I did when I first started using ELS together with SirenMastery is I changed all of these options here in sounds to false. The issue is SirenMastery and ELS have a conflict. And let me jump back into the game here. I'll demonstrate what the conflict is. So if we get out of our menu here, and I'll get into my vehicle. So what happens is, if you have SirenMastery and ELS mapped to one key together, it will actually both activate the ELS siren as well as the SirenMastery siren. So let me put this into, let me do that right now. So here's our ELS siren, which is using the default sirens that are installed in the game, which I have not changed. And now let me turn on my sirens that I'm using with SirenMastery. There it is. Now what happens is, if you have SirenMastery bound to the same key as ELS, and by default you cannot change ELS keys, at least at this time, on the controller, so they're all set in stone. By default the controller key is D-pad down. If that's the same key that you have your SirenMastery set to, what will happen here is, for example, if I was to let me do this. If I had SirenMastery running, no, there we go. And let's say I arrive to the scene and I want to turn off my siren and get out of the car. By pressing D-pad down, it would turn off SirenMastery, but then it would turn on the ELS sirens. So you're not essentially turning anything off. And when you press it again to turn off the ELS sirens, it would turn on SirenMastery siren. So that's the conflict. So what I did to get around that is then I disabled all of the sound by setting them to false. So that actually solved my problem. I can press D-pad down, it would activate SirenMastery, and ELS would not turn on. The issue with doing that, if you set all of these to false, is that you essentially disable the siren for the AI vehicles as well. And I noticed that the backup units that were using the vehicle where I set all of these to false had the lights on but did not have any siren sounds at all. So you want to make sure you actually leave all of these at true, because otherwise your AI units will not have any sirens when they're responding to calls or helping you with your calls. So that's one thing. So you want to make sure you set it to true. Now, you cannot change the ELS key, so that's always going to be set in stone, at least for the time being, with the D-pad down. So what you want to do is you want to remap your SirenMastery key, and in my case, I remapped it to X. So let me just show you that quickly, and I'm actually going to make a separate tutorial video for SirenMastery and how to install it. But if I go into my folder here for SirenMastery and I click on config, under my controller config, what you can see right here, this option, toggle siren button on the controller, the default is D-pad right. I had it mapped to D-pad down, and I now remapped it to X. So when I actually get into my vehicle now, and let me just turn off the light completely. When I get into my vehicle now, I don't press D-pad down, I always press X to activate my sirens here with SirenMastery. So that's the conflict. You want to avoid using the same keys that basically ELS is using, and the way to get around it is to use X, in my case here on the controller, to activate the SirenMastery sirens. So I think that's essentially it. I think that for the most part we'll cover ELS and some of the options and the settings that come with it. I hope that this tutorial video kind of give you a bit of an overview of how to how to configure ELS, what sort of settings and options are important to look at. If you have any questions, absolutely, please post them in the comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know what other tutorial videos you'll want to see, because at the end of the day, I'm doing this for you guys. So if you're having issues with LSPDFR, if there's some mods that are not working for you, let me know what they are, and I'm going to hopefully be able to figure it out and answer your questions, as well as make some additional videos to showcase some of my other mods. Thank you very much for checking it out. Hey, don't forget to check out LSPDFR videos as well, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Let's Talk. Just investigating a noise complaint out here. Somebody called in and said they were hearing some strange noises come out of this field. Oh, well, that would explain it. Dispatch 3 Adam 10, work code 4.